Good, man. Good to have you on here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, this is great. So Pastor Rob, as our audience members probably know, or most of them know, he's preparing to deploy soon. And so we've been talking about the podcast going forward, having some different guests. And so you get to be the first one after his departure here. So you're kind of like the guinea pig.
It's a privilege and an honor.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Awesome. It's good to have you here. So Brian's, for our audience's sake, just mentioned that Brian's an elder here at Cornerstone. How many years have you been an elder here, Brian?
Just over one.
Oh, really? Okay. All right. So I'm new here. I got here in July, and so you've been here a year as an elder, but then you've been here at the church for how long? That's been a long time.
28 years.
Wow. 28 years?
7 years.
Wow.
Something like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's a long time for sure. Okay. Well, we've talked about a whole bunch of different topics together, and one of them recently was technology. We were talking about technology.
Yep.
I can't even remember the exact context of the conversation, but we said, hey, if we're going to have a podcast together, let's maybe touch on that and talk about technology and kind of seeing it through the lenses of redemption and the gospel and trying to encourage one another and encourage our audience in terms of God's involvement with it. Because I think there are probably some who are almost entirely negative in their view of technological advancements. And then there are others who are like almost like naively optimistic and overly positive about it, but not seeing the balanced perspective.
Right.
And we all could use some help in terms of framing it within the sovereignty of God, the redemptive plan of God. So that's what we're going to attempt to do. So
sounds good.
So as a starting question, I'll let you speak to this one. What would be some of the most significant technological advancements of the last, let's say, the last 20 years?
Well, if we can step back even further from that.
Go for it.
Well, not even just in time, but what do we mean by technology?
Okay.
Right. I came across an interesting quote from a computer scientist. The guy's name is Alan Kay. And he said that technology is anything that was invented after you were born. Everything else is just stuff. And it's that speaks to the idea that we are so immersed in technological advancements that we're not even conscious of it. The fact that we're sitting here in this room right now with artificial lights, right? Speaking into microphones. This is just part of being. And yet at one point, these things were brand new innovations that came on the scene.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about technology, another helpful definition that I've come across is that technology is any sort of tool that amplifies your natural human ability.
Okay.
So for example, we're recording this, right? There's only one other person in this room right now.
There is.
And that's our
he's being
lovely
distracting.
producer who's every now and then can be a distraction. But there's only one other person in this room right now who's hearing our voices. And yet, Lord willing, others beyond this room are going to hear that. So it's amplifying their ability to hear and perceive things. They're not bound by geography. They're not bound by time. And so that technology enables people to do things beyond their natural capabilities. You can see it elsewhere, any sort of, the visual media, print, books, the fact that we're able to...
The printing press is one of huge technological advancements.
Absolutely.
The 1400s.
So many of these things have come along, and they're just now part of our everyday lives. We don't even give it a second thought.
Right.
So to answer your original question, obviously the printing press, huge. The whole concept of the Industrial Revolution, the movement away from individual mom and pop shops to factories,
mass production,
right? The concept of electricity and having electricity in your homes. So many of these things, and obviously more recently, the internet.
Is it going like 80s, 90s? I mean, I'm trying to remember, thinking back to even the old dial-up, and hearing that noises and all that.
And I think I remember
modem was dialing up in the 90s, right?
Yeah, I think it was 93 because I think I just saw a post recently on the internet.
Okay,
speaking
about
to
the internet.
Exactly, I spoke to the anniversary of the first internet connection on a mass scale. If you think back, I don't know if you've ever seen the clip from the Today Show of Bryant Gumbel and Katie Couric talking about email and what is this little @? symbol, and they weren't really sure what that was about. And yet now nobody gives it a second thought.
Right.
You
Just
pull
take
out
it
your
for
phone
granted.
and we've seen a lot of these advances. And as you and I were mentioning earlier, it feels like these advances are getting closer and closer together.
Yes.
That we're moving by leaps and bounds.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Another big one without a doubt would be the smartphone. I think the first iPhone came out in 2007, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Okay. So just that idea, now we get a phone that, as one comedian says, the phone is a seldom used app on my phone. Like there's so many other apps and all these things that we use the phone, all these other tools, right. that we use the phone for. Yep. And my kids, your kids kind of take for granted a world in which almost everybody has a cell phone and has a smartphone with all those capabilities. So that would be another huge one, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's said that the computing power on your cell phone is actually more computing power than it took for the Apollo moon landing.
Wow.
So like we have more technology in our pocket than it took to get folks to the moon and back. Like,
listen, that's amazing.
It's insane.
I remember in the 80s, my dad was kind of into the latest technology back then. And so remember, everybody was getting the Commodore 64. Remember that?
Yep.
And somehow my dad scored a Commodore 64C.
Okay.
So the Commodore 64 is like the brown colored, if you recall.
Yep.
But this Commodore 64C, man, it was like the upgraded version. And I remember sitting down, he had bought this programming book. This is just for fun. This is a little anecdote for you.
These are good.
How interesting things have changed, changed so much. He bought this big fat book on programming, and I was eager to dive into it and play with this computer. So I sat down with this book, and I actually had to follow the instructions in the book, and it walked you through typing in this program to the computer, and it went on. And I probably spent 2 hours, felt like 2 days, but I just typing in this long program. And at the end of it, I hit enter, and you know what it did? The screen just changed colors from like blue, green.
And that was a big deal.
Yellow. And that was a huge deal.
But then the more important question, could you save it after you finished?
No, that was it. That was it. It just, you did all that work.
Exactly.
So to think of what we have now, it is unbelievable.
Yeah, it's insane.
So true. So in light of that, okay, we're all, as you said, we take so many things for granted, and then there's like seems like daily these new items are released, or there's more talk about. We're going to get into things like AI and things like that. So I want to start by saying, and this is what made this kind of on the forefront of my mind, is I was talking with one of my daughters the other day, and she said, "Dad, I wish I would have grown up at another time. I wish I would." And she was thinking back of her grandfather, because he was talking about playing with the neighborhood kids and riding his bike and how different it was then versus now. And she kind of said, hey, this is a scary time, especially since COVID and some of the changes that took place then. Was just a sense in which, hey, is an ominous sense to this sort of thing. And so for my daughter to say that, and we ended up having this conversation about God and his appointment in our lives, in terms of, hey, he selected when we would live. And so I'm going to share this verse with you that I talked to her about in Acts 17, where Paul is talking to some of the philosophers, and he is giving a gospel witness there, and he's appealing to them on the basis of some of the things they had understood or presupposed. And he says, hey, God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek him, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. So we talked about this idea that God created all of us. We all go back to our forefather and our foremother, and he's ordained for us to have our place in human history, and he selected that the Pierce family would be living at this very time. And there's a certain comfort in that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, so that as you're seeing all this change, it's encouraging to remember that God is still on the throne. He's still ruling and reigning over his creation. And we're going to get into this a little bit later, I believe, but some of the fears that can come with technology, that they need not affect us. It's possible by God's grace to just rest in who he is and trust in the fact that he's over all of this and he's got it under control.
Yep.
Especially when it can feel like it's just things are moving faster than we'd care them to move, and yet God is still in charge of all of it.
Yeah, that's really good. And that's going to be an anchor for us, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. But let me start with a little bit more about sort of the benefits. Okay, so what are some things we can say are clearly benefits of these technological advancements, the positive side, the upside?
So much. Like, where do you begin? Again, electricity, the fact that we're able to live in relative comfort after the sun goes down, because we have artificial lights in our houses. We can flip a switch and we can still see, we can read, we can interact with others. It's not, okay, the sun's gone down, so now it's time to go to bed. We have the ability to engage with one another longer. We're not bound by the presence or absence of the sun.
Right.
From a medical standpoint, you think about all the technological advancements in the field of medicine
that have prolonged life. The lifespan is much longer,
and not just longer, but in many instances, the quality of life
qualitatively.
Absolutely. And so you see, I'll touch this rail for a second because folks have different opinions on vaccines and whatnot. I'm not. My goal is not to get into
that. We're going there.
Oh,
Mike, buckle up. This is about to get interesting. No, go ahead.
Recently, I saw a documentary. I was actually during COVID. Saw a documentary about polio.
Yeah.
And how polio consistently would ravage communities. And kids, parents were scared to send their kids out because it wasn't clear how this was contracted and
spread.
Is it this guy or is it that guy? Who's going to send my kid and have to live in an iron lung? I mean, it was horrible. And then, Jonas Salk comes out with this vaccine and all of a sudden kids are getting better. Kids aren't getting sick, and the rate of polio just dropped dramatically. And speaking with one of the deacons here at Cornerstone, he remembers living through that. He had a friend who was in an iron lung. And yet through the development of these vaccines, we had folks that were able to then avoid that trauma. So in so many areas, it's just there are lots of benefits that we experience every day. The fact that we could have a communication. You called me earlier today. I wasn't in the same room as you, and yet we had a conversation. I mean, it's a simple thing. And this goes to what I was speaking about earlier, that these things we take for granted because they're everywhere. They're part of our everyday lives. And yet these advancements in technology are what enable us to, in some instances, we can maintain constant contact with one another, which has its drawbacks. Absolutely.
Right.
But at the same time, we know, hey, you know what? I can shoot you a text and say, hey, man, struggling with this, pray for me. And that instant dialogue back and forth, it's available to us by means of technology.
That's a great gift. Absolutely. We've been talking about with Pastor Rob's deployment. Hey, we're going to be able to keep in touch with him on a regular basis. We're talking about ways to stream him into a service.
Exactly.
Do a podcast, film a podcast with him when he's on the other side of the globe, So it is true. And then we could get into, and it's sort of obvious, but definitely worth stating. You think about the usefulness of the printing press when it comes to spreading biblical truth, spreading gospel truth, and all from replicating scripture and the endless. Of course, we have all these different translations now, but it's so readily accessible, right? And then you just think of gospel communication that's gone out there. And at one time, you had to send a person; they had to physically be there. And now we have the ability through the internet, through the airwaves, to just get this message out there. And there are, countless different ways and countless different tools by which to speak truth and proclaim the gospel to people, and that's a great benefit as well, obviously. So there's so many good things. I don't know if you have any other thoughts before we kind of leave that and move on to some of the concerns or some of the fearful aspects. Anything else you'd want to say?
Yeah, one of the other insights that I've been reading lots from Tony Reinke. And
what's the name of that book again, Brian?
Sorry. So this is called God, Technology, and the Christian Life. It's basically a biblical theology of technology. And it's what little I was able to read of it. It's very helpful.
We've both been cramming for
yes,
this.
we were cramming. But one of the things he highlights is that technology, in a small way, in a very faint way, is a reflection of God's glory. Because we recognize that, number one, he's the creator of everything, right? Including the minds that were able to develop these things.
Innovation itself
it is a reflection
from
absolutely.
God's.
So all technology is derivative, right? So it's the minds of these technological creators are dependent. Their very life, their being is dependent on the creator. But then the materials, the raw materials that are used, he alludes to several times in the book. I think it's 60 elements that make up an iPhone. God creates each individual one, places them exactly where they are in the earth, provides the life and breath to be able to mine these things, transform them into other materials that are then used to create this thing that we call an iPhone. So in all of that, we can see a reflection of God's glory. Obviously, you think of the scriptures, the heavens declare the glory of God, right? Romans 1 speaks of the creation itself, speaks of God's eternal power and Godhead. And so the natural order absolutely reflects God's glory. But in a derivative sense, we can also see a faint picture of God's glory in these technological things, because we recognize that it's only by the grace of the Creator, the common grace of the Creator, that we're able to enjoy these things.
Have these,
So
right.
that's another positive thing that sometimes we don't always think of.
Right.
There's a line in the book. He says, "When's the last time you thanked God for fossil fuels?" The fact that I was able to drive over here, I didn't have to run or deal with any of those challenges. We were just get in the car, start it up, and you're on. And so we see God's glory reflected in all these things. So these are all a means of thankfulness to who God is and his provision for us.
Yeah, that's excellent, man. That's a really good reminder when we do take so many of these things for granted. And it's also a safeguard against the overly or solely negative view of this. And we say, hey, look, there's a lot of positive. This too is a part of God's good creation and a product of created beings made in God's image who have these innovations and advancements. It's the product that are just, like you said, make our lives enjoyable, help us to connect with people. There's so many benefits. So it's really good. So let's then kick a little bit of a turning point and admit, like everything in this world from the very beginning of time, even you think of something like a tool, like a primitive tool, a primitive hammer, whenever the first hammer was from, who knows, right? Way back when, the Bronze Age or whenever, right? Could be used as a weapon. So anything in this world, the basic elements themselves, go back to a rock. I mean, you can go just back to a rock could be used as a weapon. Or it can be used in a positive way to build a structure of some kind. So, so all these things can be used for good or for evil. And that kind of forces us to consider, well, why is that the case? Well, that's the case because of humanity's fall, humanity's rebellion against our Creator. So we take the God-given gifts we have and then use them to exploit others, to give ourselves an advantage of some kind in our own lusts, our own greed, our own anger or hatred of others. And so that has not changed. All these technological things are so different today from even just 10 years ago, let alone thousands of years ago. But what hasn't changed is, as Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun. The human condition is the human condition. And that's why this has such a dark side to it, because of what people have done with it, with technological tools and advancements, what they are doing and what potentially people could do with them. So that's where we start to get into, this is concerning. For sure, there are some concerns. So what would you say would be some of the main concerns, whether that's concerns you yourself have or ones you've read about or heard people talk about?
Yeah, so I know one of the things you and I've talked about is this idea of addiction. And, I'll confess for the mass audience here, absolutely. I mean, looking at the phone, every time you're looking for something that fix, and as I don't want to steal your thunder, but
go for it.
That psychologist that you were quoting,
Dr. Lemke.
So Dr. Lemke talking about this idea of dopamine hits. And after listening to that, the realization, it's like, this is what's happening every time I go to look at whatever. So you're looking to see, even for, ministry oriented social media things, how many views
likes,
did we get? How many likes? How many comments? How many new subscribers did we get? Constantly checking that and doing it because it's giving that hit of dopamine, that feel good reward of like, oh, this feels great. Yeah, we got so many subscribers. This is wonderful. And then 5 minutes later, you want to check it again because I want to get that. It's holding out this carrot that there's this other hit awaiting you. Whether or not it's actually going to happen, there's no guarantee of that. So that type of addiction, huge drawback, because then what is it doing? It's taking our time, it's taking our attention away from family, away from responsibilities. You can find yourself just, the term doom scrolling, where you're just, you just keep scrolling through the feed to see, is there a refresh. And so it's a huge time waster at the end of the day.
Yeah. And to your point, your honest confession, and it's the same for me. I even times, okay, I'm going to turn it off. I'm going to stay away from it for a while. I'm going to have this like technology fast. And then it seems inevitable. Something comes up, like, I need it. And really for our work, even for your work, even for my ministry work, we need it. We need this tool to stay connected with people, like we talked about earlier. But I think part of the redeeming of this type of situation is, okay, being aware of that and understanding, wow, this can be a slave master to me. So that awareness itself can be helpful in saying, okay, are there other measures I can take? Are there things I can do, whether myself or my family? I've been looking back at this book, The Tech Wise Family, where they talk about, okay, they recommend, come up with ways to turn it on. Even if you're just going to go for a walk, together as a family outside, spend time doing other things and be more deliberate about that. See the health benefit of that, both from a mental or psychological standpoint, but also from a physiological standpoint. It is healthy for us to be active. And so, and that even wasn't necessarily planned, but as a sort of segue, as we talk about technology advancing in terms of robotics, manufacturing, in one sense, that's made food production easier and has led to the feeding of many previously starving people. And that's a great thing. On the other hand, to eliminate manual labor and physical work also has a downside because of the dangers of a sedentary life. And so there's that concern, right?
Yeah. I think there can also be a sense in which having advances of technology can make the individual feel somewhat autonomous. Like, I'm in control of this situation. I am God, right? So whether you're talking about AI, where I don't need to rely on a photographer to develop that picture for me, I can just key in words into DALL-E and it'll spit out an image that's perfect. I can do that all by myself, which again, that sense of empowerment of like, I don't need anybody else. I can do this all by myself. It's like the 4-year-old. I do it by myself, only much more sophisticated. But that sense of empowerment absolutely can get to people's heads, and now there isn't dependence on the creator. It's, I can do this all by myself. I don't need anybody else to do this.
And so with that one, for example, like the human condition hasn't changed, but the opportunities, the outlets for that condition are alarming. For sure. And it is enticing to that sense of autonomy. Absolutely. 100%. So I have on my notes here, I'd seen an interview. Elon Musk was interviewed recently, and he was asked about AI and the concern about it. And one of the things that he said, which to me got my attention, he said, what happens when something vastly smarter than the smartest person comes along? It's very difficult to predict what would happen after that. It's very hard to predict. It has the potential of civilization destruction. So that's a pretty, gloomy, to put it mildly, statement.
Understatement.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong statement. So, but he's talking about AI and this artificial intelligence, and how basically there's this concern that it could take on a life of its own. It could kind of become a mind of its own. And then, where does that go? So if someone brought that up to you, someone said, hey, I heard Elon Musk said this, and I'm terrified, we're going to end up like some of these movies from like the 90s and other, times when they were sort of predict, or like these doom and gloom prophecies of, the machines take over, and humanity is doomed.
Terminator.
Yeah, right. Terminator would be one of those, right? Talk to me, Brian. So encourage me, because it terrifies me.
So while I can appreciate those types of fears, because if we're being transparent, sure, there is a possibility that type of thing may come to pass. However, let's have those thoughts with our Bibles open. God is still on his throne. He still rules over all of his creation. The fact that Elon Musk could even say that was only by the will of a sovereign God. If God
upholding
said
all things by the word of his power, that very moment that was being uttered.
Absolutely. And so at the end of the day, we need to remember who God is. We need to remember the care that he has for his people. And like, the Great Commission hasn't changed. Even under that dystopian future, even if that comes to pass, guess what? We're still going and making disciples of all the nations. And Christ is with us to the end of the age. And so there's great comfort in that. In terms of like a very practical nuts and bolts, well, how do we deal with that type of thing? Great question.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is going to come down to and this is where Tony Reinke deals with this in his book, those types of human interactions, especially as you move to a society where there's more and more artificial things, virtual experiences, the whole Zuckerberg, the metaverse, where you're living in this, computerized version of
you
yourself.
have an avatar. It's called an avatar of yourself.
And
you
like
can
people
be who you've always wanted to be in real life, but you're not. You can become in
exactly.
This
And they're like
digital
buying
world,
and
this
selling
virtual
real
world.
estate, like millions of dollars worth of real estate that doesn't exist.
It's
like,
it's mind blowing.
It is.
It's like the cryptocurrency thing. It's like,
exactly. But so even with that, as you remove from physical interaction, how much more value is there as the church to be able to minister to people physically, to serve one another, to express love to one another? You can't do that digitally. You were speaking earlier about the limitations of some of these robots and these AI-powered bots that are being used in
for nursing,
exactly, elder care, things like that. Even as good as those things can be, there's still a limitation that nothing can match a human touch, a human being coming alongside, putting their arm around someone. So there's great value in that. And I think as the church, if we were to set our focus on that type of in-person, one-on-one ministry, I think that helps to counteract some of the virtualization of everything that would come in that type of a future. So to some, number one, fear not, God is in control. As you said earlier, there's nothing new under the sun. In the same way that I'm sure Christians were alarmed at technological advances in the past. The first time
television,
the first time radio came out, it's the devil is the spirit of the airwaves, and so this is his. No, let's just remember who's in control. And as it turns out, the radio was used greatly to further ministry. You think of HCJB radio there in Ecuador, where they're broadcasting the gospel to so many nations as a result of radio. So a lot of benefit came from that. Same with the television that came along, and it was this scary thing. Same with the internet. So I think with any of these technologies, as they come on the scene, there's a little bit of fear that comes along with that, that can come along with that. And while it can be abused, I think it can be encouraging for us at the same time to just remember that God is in control, to leverage these things for good, and to serve one another using these things. These can all be tools that we can use to serve one another in the spirit of Christ. So as God leads us, as he enables us, gives us opportunity, we just simply would take advantage of those tools and use them for his glory.
Yep. And part of that is in seeking to leverage them for good, an awareness of, the pitfalls, the dangers, even like we talked about. Hey, it was a good reminder to me. Oh yeah, it's true. Like this is an addictive, like the phone itself is addictive. The dopamine hits, man, they just keep you coming back, and it's very easy to ignore family members, responsibilities, healthier activities, right? So that's a good thing, practically speaking. That's a wise application of the things we're talking about. At the same time, that foundational matter, though we could call it almost overarching and foundational in terms of God's sovereignty over all things. I think of Jesus saying, "Don't be anxious for tomorrow," and he knows he said it because he knows we tend to be anxious, right? And so remembering his control. One of the passages that came to my mind, I have my Bible open to it, but I don't need to read it necessarily, but just in summary, you think of the Tower of Babel. And in some senses, these AI capabilities remind me of what happened at the Tower of Babel, like people coming together, even just the internet, you could say the global reach of the internet, right? So it's like this global type of tool and people coming together. Oh boy, almost nothing will be impossible for people. But then you see God intervening and seeing to it that they're not able to do any more than he allows them to do. He's not ever going to let it go beyond what he allows. And to your point earlier, if he allows that to go some dystopian direction beyond the dystopia we've all been living in already, if he allows that to happen, that too is for his good purposes. He will take care of us. Our future is secured. So that's, naturally speaking, it's difficult to trust and rest in that, clearly. And all of us have and for sure would struggle through that, no question. Meanwhile, we would have this, both God's word telling us, opportunities to, as you said earlier, to continue interacting with one another, reminding one another of what is true, and basically living with that assurance and reminding each other of that assurance that To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. No one will thwart his purposes or plans. There's so many places. He's declared the end from the very beginning. Right. So it's like it's not going off the rails.
Exactly.
He's not outside of control.
Exactly. He's not. God isn't surprised by ChatGPT.
Yeah, he's not. That is, we got to talk about before we wrap up. We got to talk ChatGPT because I think this could be a fun part of our podcast. Okay, because first of all, we need to say what it is, and we'll do that in a second. But after we say what it is, I think you and I had to have like a friendly debate about it because you have a more positive view of it than I do. And I want you to try to persuade me, and I'll do my best to persuade you. That'll make it interesting, right? And they'll hopefully help us to be really focused so we don't continue looking over at our
I will endeavor to
producer.
not look over at the producer getting his workout in for the day.
For sure. He looks tired over
I think we should go another hour. I mean, at least just to keep
for
his...
sure. Oh, yeah. It's be good for him.
He's going to be jacked by the end of the night.
His shoulders are going to be ripped. ChatGPT.
ChatGPT.
So this will help our audience immensely.
Yep.
If you would say what GPT stands for, actually, I'm being sarcastic. It won't help at all because what it stands for is not helpful. But go ahead. Do you know what it stands for?
I looked. Oh, good, because I looked it up and I forgot. It's generative something trans something.
Generative pre-trained transformer.
Yeah,
that's what it stands for.
I'm looking for a Decepticon in there somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I think.
Optimus Prime,
Decepticons, right? Chat GPT, not GBT. People say it quickly. So Chat GPT. Yes. Okay, so it's generative pre-trained transformer. What in the world does that mean? I don't even know how that applies to what it actually is, but somehow those words supposedly are connected to what it actually is. So what is it actually?
In layman's terms, it is a computer. This is like the simplest of terms, so people are going to pick this apart and say, that's wrong, that's wrong. But in the
don't worry, the tens and tens of people who listen to this, of those 35 individuals, I don't think anyone's going to pick it apart too bad. Go ahead.
So it is a computer that basically enables you to converse with it. You can ask questions, but it goes beyond like Google, where you're looking up things and it's finding existing web content that matches your search terms. This actually has been trained because it's culling all of the internet. I believe there's also additional material outside the internet, print materials that have been digitized that have trained this computer. And so it's able to take all of this information and synthesize it. That's, I think, the leaps and bound moment in this technology, because it's synthesizing this existing information and it's able to spit out something for you that. So, for example, you could ask it a simple question, what is the gospel? And it will give you a theologically sound description of what the gospel is. When it first was made available to the public, this has only been out for maybe 6 months, 7 months. I asked it to write me a sermon on the parable of the prodigal son in a conversational style. And literally within seconds, I'm not talking about, it's thinking. This was instantaneously, it starts like spitting this out. And it gave me a 3-point sermon outlining the parable of the prodigal son. And it was theologically sound. So
I want to read that sermon because I don't think it was theologically sound. But yeah. And
it was gospel oriented. Okay. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
And so I've used it just for fun. Frankly, I do it with my kids. We've asked it to write screenplays about nonsensical things. Hallmark movies set in the world of the video game Plants vs. Zombies. It does all kinds of, but it gives answers that are what you would reasonably expect for such a setup. And so that's just the fun part. It can be used as a valuable tool. I have used it to generate social media content.
This is where we start to move into why I'm going to counter argue. But go ahead. Well, not really on that point, but go ahead. But it can be a useful tool.
It can be useful to generate ideas. So rather than sitting there racking my brain saying, what do you say about this? No, you can ask, act as a social media manager. And I want you to generate an Instagram caption for a post about such and such, where you name a passage or whatever. And then it will give you a caption instantly. It'll even throws in some hashtags to use. Like it's
even to that point.
Wow. So I've seen people, you can code with this. in certain coding languages. Now, in some instances, the accuracy of the information is totally off.
Yeah, I've heard that. Seen
Where
some examples of that.
Whether just factual or if you're asking it to, I've seen musicians do things like, write a guitar solo, and it comes up with some crazy nonsense.
Yeah.
So obviously it has its limitations, but
and it's only one iteration of there will be many, and they'll continue to refine it.
Well, and now that the other players have gotten into that space more publicly, so Microsoft has their product, Google has their product called Bard that they just came out with. That's sort of their version. It's interesting to ask them both the same question and see their responses. But so the long and the short of it is ChatGPT is right now to me a fun tool, but it can also be a very productive tool to generate content, to create verbal content.
Another example I think that's worth mentioning is, for example, in school. It's a problem at the university level, especially because you could literally type in or talk to it however you interact with it. You could type in, hey, write me an essay on the Industrial Revolution, and it will spit one out just
instantly.
like that. And it won't, if two different students at two different universities put in the same command, they would get different essays, right?
I believe
depending
it
on
does,
some parameters, maybe.
Correct. I believe, and it's also the context. That's the other thing, is it remembers the questions you've asked to it up to that point, so that you can establish a context to say, okay, I'm a social media manager for a church. Now generate this content. I'm a grad student in architectural studies. Now write me a thing about Frank Lloyd Wright. That type of thing. They have talked about introducing some sort of digital watermark so that professors will be able to distinguish something that was generated from this as opposed to something that was created on their own.
As opposed to just saying, there's no way that dumb student came up with that brilliant paper. Yeah, that's the that's the non-technological way to ferret that out. Yeah.
All right, hit me.
So here's the thing. Okay. Let's say you asked ChatGPT to write your wife a love letter for you.
Which I would never do that.
But if you did and you gave it to her, and at first she thought it was from you. And then she learned later that it was actually a product of ChatGPT.
Right.
Go. But what would your defense be? Yeah, exactly. You'd be gone.
I'd be on the couch or out the door.
It's almost similar to what we said about robots and other forms of technology, where you can't duplicate or replace human connection.
Right.
So, and I know you agree with me on this, but that's just one avenue of this, like to think, this again, where technology is amazing. What people have come up with is remarkable, but you still can't do it as good as God did it.
Correct.
Right? So that would be an example. And then when I just thinking about, I would not critique using it for social media, but I think about guys who are going to be tempted to use it for sermons.
Yes.
Okay. I think when Paul says, well, let me just, foundationally, I would say, hey, our righteousness is in Christ. There's freedom in areas. And this is one of those areas I would say. But I would be careful also to point out the way Paul describes his ministry to people, even the letters he wrote, the sermons that he preached, the time that he had with, he says, I think it's in 1 Thessalonians, that it was his desire and commitment to impart to them not only the gospel, but his own soul. There's a way in which he's saying, like, it's through the channel of myself that I'm conveying this message to you. So again, you lose that personal connection, which, I mean, God can use anything. He can use a tract or a piece of paper with some biblical truth on it. He uses his word, which is an inanimate object. Okay, so he can, but there is also something ordained and special about speaking the gospel from one heart to another. Right. I know you agree with that too.
Well, and I think that the more foundational than even that is to say the gift of teaching is a gift. It's a spiritual gift. So there's a spiritual activity that's happening when someone steps into a pulpit and starts to speak the words of God. ChatGPT can't do that. Obviously, as with any technology, there are limitations. At the same time, there are lots of benefits that can be there for mundane things. You talked about writing a love letter to my wife using ChatGPT, which I will not try. But I actually...
Husbands, take note. Do not
let the
try this
listener
at
understand. There actually was an incident of something like that where there was a shooting at a university, I think in Michigan State, just a few months ago. And they sent a letter to the student body, and somebody found out that they generated it using ChatGPT.
Is that right? Wow.
Like devastating.
Wow.
because right, it's that
It's not
you
true.
need human
It's like
communication.
artificial empathy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So huge technology, huge potential to, if you're a journalist, man, it would be so easy if this thing were up on current events. That's the thing. It only, I think it's current up to the end of 2021.
Okay.
So recent events, it's not going to be useful. But if it were, man, you could easily spit out news articles. And I think there are some outlets that have started doing that. They've actually gotten rid of some of their staff because these are simple, low grade internet articles that anybody can churn out. Well, if I can have a robot do it for me for free, why am I going to pay somebody?
Yeah.
So there are benefits that can come with it. Absolutely, it has its limitations, as with any technology. But my personal take is, man, it's a really fun tool to play with. So
At
I would
some
strongly
point,
encourage
I will give
fiddling
it a
around.
shot. Maybe after we press stop on the record over there, you can show me,
Or when
because I
Mike's
would
arms
like
fall off.
to play with it a little bit. Yeah, we'll make Mike go a little longer. He's barely hanging on over there. We should, what we could do is just get a robot to do that, and
There
then we
you
don't
go.
even need Mike anymore.
There you go.
But see how sad that would be, though. I mean,
would be
it would be
very
It would be
depressing.
very sad. There's a reason you don't have one. All right, so I think we should wrap it up. It's been a good conversation. Obviously, it's just like scraping the surface.
Absolutely,
I mean,
yeah.
there's so many things. I had all different ideas, but I think we hit the big ideas that we wanted to hit, and maybe just close on this note, which we've said, but just to reiterate, look, God is in control. Nobody's going to pull anything off
Right.
somehow outside of his ability to stop it. All is under his purview for sure. He has determined the end from the beginning. He has a redemptive plan. We fall within that plan at this very specific time in history. And there's a great cause of rejoicing in that, and hope in that. There's an anchor for us in that. And I think both of us would advocate not sticking your head in the sand. Like, don't ignore what's going on. Be aware of these things. Try to leverage these tools. Be aware of the pitfalls of these tools.
Exactly.
And then trust in God. That's kind of our message, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And even then, as we think about that, we think of Christ and how he was subjected to the worst evils, and God used the betrayal of Jesus, the execution of Jesus, to bring about our salvation and our redemption, and everything else that happens in this fallen, cursed world. He causes to ultimately bring about redemptive purposes.
These are just tools for his ends and his purposes. So it's good.
So that's good. Well, on that note, Brian, would you mind closing us in prayer here?
Absolutely. Let's
All right,
pray.
thank you.
Father, we thank you. Thank you for your creative power. Thank you for the things you have created, the way that they reflect your glory. Thank you for the minds that you have given your creatures to be able to develop these different technological tools. Lord, help us to rest in you, to rest in knowing that you are in control of all things at all times in every way. Father, you are sovereign, and we rest in that. Help us not to be fearful of these things as they come along. Help us to be wise, that we would be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. Father, help us to be good stewards of these things that you have allowed for us to have in our use at this time in history. Lord, and in all things, we trust that you will continue to be glorified, and you will use even these things that are used for sinful ends, that you will ultimately turn them for good, and that you will be glorified in it all. Father, we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.